Welcome back to the deep dive. You guys are really interested in intelligence analysis
Mm.
because you sent us a whole stack of material on the topic.
Yeah.
So we're diving into a classic today, Richard Heuer's Psychology of Intelligence Analysis.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a user's manual for your brain,
Right.
especially when you're dealing with really complex situations.
Yeah.
So have you ever noticed how like a single vivid story can just completely outweigh hard data?
Oh, yeah.
Or how easy it is for us to jump to conclusions even when, like, maybe we don't have all the information.
All the time. That's what
Yeah.
we're going to be unpacking today. How your mind actually works when you're trying to analyze information and how you can use that knowledge to your advantage.
Yeah, so, like, it's fascinating to me how often we just kind of, like, overlook the human element in all of this, in intelligence analysis.
Mm.
It's not just about the data. It's about how our minds process it.
Exactly.
Right.
Heuer actually compares intelligence analysts to psychoanalysts. You have to understand your own thinking before you can understand someone else's.
Well, I like that.
Yeah.
So, like, we've all totally misread a situation before because we're just, like, projecting our own assumptions.
Oh, yeah.
Right? But this idea of bounded rationality, that we create these mental shortcuts to deal with all the complexity,
Right.
is that actually like a bad thing?
Well, those shortcuts are how we're able to function,
Right.
in a world where there's so much information coming at us all the time. But they can lead us astray, they can lead us into these perception traps. For example, think of that experiment where you show people a series of images, morphing from a man's face into a woman's face.
Okay.
And what you see in the middle, those images in between, it depends on what image you started with.
Right.
So if you start with a man's face, you're more likely to see the more masculine features as it morphs into a woman's face and vice versa.
Right.
So it's the same thing with intelligence analysis. Those initial impressions that we make, even if they're based on very limited data, those are really hard to shake.
Yeah.
They end up coloring how we interpret everything else that comes after.
It's like when you meet someone, you get a first impression,
Mm-hmm.
and even when they like show you that they're not that way,
Mm-hmm.
you still kind of like hold on to that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like our minds are constantly filtering and interpreting all this information through like this lens of our past experiences.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about how memory itself plays into this. It's this giant web, right?
Yeah. So we have short-term memory, which is like this little tiny notepad that we can only hold a few things in our mind at once.
Right.
And then we have this vast interconnected web of long-term memory.
Okay.
And that's made up of what are called schemata, which are these mental frameworks that we use to organize and retrieve information. And expertise in anything, whether it's chess, medicine, or intelligence analysis, it's built on those schemata. It's about seeing patterns that other people might miss.
So like someone who's an expert in a certain field basically has like a bigger web with like more connections and more context to pull from.
Exactly.
Okay. But we don't just passively store information. We have to actually use it to make judgments.
Right.
Right. So how does that process actually work?
Well, Heuer outlines three main approaches that we use: situational logic, applying theory, and comparison.
Okay.
So situational logic, you're basically just focused on the immediate context.
Okay.
You're trying to figure out the specific motivations of the people involved, the constraints that they're operating under.
Okay.
Applying theory, you're thinking about broader models that might apply to the situation, like political science theories, economic principles, things that help you see the bigger picture beyond the immediate situation. And then comparison is all about looking at historical parallels to see if you can generate insights, generate hypotheses about what might happen in the current situation.
Okay. So each approach has its own strengths, but also potential weaknesses, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you're too focused on the current context, you might miss some of those historical patterns or broader theoretical frameworks.
Right.
And if you rely too much on theory, you might overlook some of the specific details of the current situation.
Exactly. And that's actually what happened with a lot of the analysts who misjudged the Shah of Iran's stability.
Oh, right.
Because they were relying too much on the theory that authoritarian leaders who have strong military backing are very difficult to overthrow.
Right, right.
But they overlooked all of these other factors that were specific to this situation in Iran.
So it's all about understanding the nuances of each approach and knowing when to use which one. Okay, so Heuer goes beyond just what we think, though. He gets into how we think. He really emphasizes the importance of challenging our own thinking.
Yes.
And I think that's where his book gets really practical.
It does. And one of the key things that he talks about is the importance of generating multiple hypotheses rather than just settling on the first one that seems plausible.
Yeah.
So instead of just stopping there, force yourself to think of other possible explanations, even if they seem unlikely at first.
Okay.
Because, the most obvious explanation, that's probably what everyone else is thinking of.
Right.
If you want to come up with something truly insightful, something that's going to be unexpected, you have to push yourself beyond that.
So it's like you're a detective at a crime scene.
Right.
You wouldn't just arrest the first person who, fits the description.
Exactly. You'd gather evidence, you'd interview witnesses, you'd explore different motives.
Right. You consider all the angles.
Yeah, and that's the approach you have to take with intelligence analysis as well.
So it's not enough to just consider different hypotheses. You have to actively test them.
Exactly. And here's a key point. He recommends focusing on disproving hypotheses rather than confirming them.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's like our natural tendency is to look for the evidence that supports what we already think. So why is it so important to try to disprove?
Because if you're only looking for evidence that supports your beliefs, you're going to miss those red flags.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to miss the inconsistencies that might actually point you in a totally different direction.
Yeah, it's like having blinders on, only seeing what we want to see.
Exactly. So be your own devil's advocate.
Okay.
Actively look for information that challenges your assumptions. It takes discipline, but it's crucial for avoiding those big intelligence failures.
Okay, so we've got to generate multiple hypotheses, then we got to try to disprove them.
Right.
Got it. Heuer also talks a lot about the importance of being aware of our own biases.
Yes.
We talked about some of them. Vividness bias, confirmation bias, overlooking missing information. It feels like there's a lot to keep track of.
There is, but awareness is the first step.
Right.
You can think of Heuer's book as a field guide to all of the different cognitive distortions that can really mess with intelligence analysis.
Okay.
And once you're aware of them, then you can start building in safeguards into your process.
Okay, so if I know that I tend towards, let's say, confirmation bias.
Right.
I could actively try to find alternative viewpoints.
Exactly. Or maybe you have a colleague play devil's advocate and really challenge your assumptions. It's about putting in those checks and balances to keep your brain from leading you astray.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of this fits together. But how do we stay open to new information, especially when it contradicts what we already believe?
Yeah.
It can be really hard to let go of those deeply held assumptions, even when the evidence suggests that we should.
Right. And that's where the concept of mindset comes in. That's your collection of beliefs, of assumptions that shape how you see the world.
But mindsets can be useful though, right?
Of course.
They give us a framework for understanding things.
They do. But they can also become rigid.
Okay.
They can blind us to new information that doesn't fit with what we already think.
Yeah.
So we have to challenge our own assumptions. We have to actively look for information that contradicts our beliefs.
That's tough to do, though. Nobody likes to be wrong.
I know, it's hard. But it's about intellectual humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that we should be open to changing our minds when new information comes in.
Okay.
Heuer actually recommends some really interesting techniques like thinking backwards.
That's thinking back.
It's basically you start with an outcome that you didn't anticipate and then you work backwards to figure out how it could have happened. That helps you break out of those linear thinking patterns and explore possibilities that you wouldn't have considered otherwise. And he also recommends what are called crystal ball exercises.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah. It's basically you imagine that you're in the future looking back on how things unfolded.
Okay.
That gives you that hindsight perspective,
Right.
which can be really helpful for identifying the warning signs that maybe you would have missed along the way.
I like this. It's like taking a step back.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this framework now for improving our analytical judgments. Define the problem clearly. Generate multiple hypotheses, seek disconfirming evidence, be aware of our biases, challenge our assumptions, and be open to new information.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
It is a lot. Heuer also offers some really good advice on the actual analytical process itself. So how to structure your analysis, how to weigh evidence, and how to communicate your conclusions effectively.
Okay, well, let's get into that because turning that theoretical knowledge into actual practical skills, I think is really important. I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty of how this actually works.
Okay. One of the key things he recommends is decomposing those complex problems into smaller, more manageable parts.
Okay, so it's like taking a giant jigsaw puzzle
Yeah.
and breaking it down into sections.
Yeah.
Makes it a lot less daunting.
Exactly, exactly. And he also suggests using visual tools like matrices to help organize the information and to see the relationships between different variables.
Oh, like you mentioned like a car buying matrix earlier.
Right.
That's a great example, like a simple tool.
Yeah.
Okay, so Heuer takes that concept further with his, what is it, analysis of competing hypotheses technique.
Right.
So this is like one of his most well-known contributions to intelligence analysis, right?
It is.
Can you walk me through how that works?
So you start by listing out all of the possible hypotheses that you've come up with.
Okay.
And then you create a matrix. And you put the hypotheses across the top, and you put the evidence down the side.
Okay, I'm picturing it like a spreadsheet, kind of.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then for each piece of evidence, you ask yourself, how consistent is this with each hypothesis? And you can use a simple plus-minus neutral system just to indicate whether the evidence supports or contradicts or is irrelevant to each hypothesis.
Okay.
And as you work your way through this matrix, you'll start to see which hypotheses have the strongest support.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe even more importantly, which ones are contradicted by the evidence.
Yeah.
And that forces you to confront those inconvenient facts. You know, the ones that maybe challenge those initial assumptions that you made.
Yeah. And when you're evaluating evidence, you also have to consider like the reliability of the source, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not all evidence is created equal.
Absolutely.
Some sources are more credible than others.
Right.
And, you know, some information is easier to verify than others.
Exactly. So you don't want to put as much weight on, say, a rumor from an unreliable source.
Right.
Compared to something that's been corroborated by multiple trusted sources.
Right. It's all about applying like that critical thinking to everything we read and hear.
Yeah. And then how you communicate your conclusions is really important too.
Yeah.
What good is a brilliant analysis if you can't explain it to anyone?
Right.
So Heuer really emphasizes transparency,
Okay.
especially when it comes to uncertainty. Don't just present your preferred hypothesis as a done deal. You need to acknowledge the other possibilities that you considered and explain why you rejected them.
So it's like showing your work, not just giving the answer.
Exactly. It helps your audience understand how you arrived at your judgment.
And it helps them assess like how much uncertainty is actually involved.
Yeah. And rather than just using vague language like possible or probable, Heuer actually suggests using more precise language. Odds ratios, percentages, confidence levels.
So it's all about giving your audience like a clear picture of how confident you are in your judgment.
Right.
And also highlighting, you know, those areas of uncertainty. It feels like so much of intelligence analysis is about dealing with uncertainty.
It is. It really is. So we've talked about a lot of Heuer's insights today.
Yeah.
You know, how our minds work, the cognitive traps to avoid, and how to actually structure our analysis for better judgments.
It's like a mental workout regimen.
Yeah.
It's for intelligence analysts.
It is. But the journey doesn't end there.
Yeah.
Once you've mastered all these techniques, you actually have to put them into practice
Right.
in the real world of intelligence analysis.
Yeah.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah, because the real world is messy
It is.
and unpredictable.
Absolutely. It starts with recognizing that we all have these biases. You know, Heuer provides us with a framework for making better judgments, and it begins with clearly defining the problem you're actually trying to solve.
Right. That sounds pretty obvious.
Yeah.
But I can see how, you know, under pressure, it'd be easy to just jump into the analysis without really like fully defining what you're trying to figure out.
Yeah, exactly. It's like heading out on a road trip without knowing where you're going.
Yeah, exactly. You might end up somewhere interesting, but it's probably not where you want it to be.
Exactly. So Heuer stresses, you know, taking the time to really frame the problem, understand those intelligence requirements before you dive into the analysis.
Okay, so once you have like a clear problem statement, then what?
Then resist that urge to latch on to that first explanation that pops into your head, that first one that seems plausible. Instead, generate multiple competing hypotheses. You know, really force yourself to consider alternative possibilities, even if they seem unlikely at first.
So like, even if one explanation seems really obvious, I shouldn't just stop there.
No, think about it this way. The most obvious explanation, that's probably what everyone else is thinking of. You know, if you really want to uncover something insightful, something unexpected, You need to push past that.
Right, yeah. Okay, I see. It's about challenging those assumptions and really exploring those less obvious possibilities.
Exactly. Heuer uses this great analogy. He says, imagine you're a detective investigating a crime scene. You wouldn't just arrest the first suspect who, kind of fits the description, would you?
Right, of course not. You would gather evidence, interview witnesses, explore different motives, right? You'd want to consider all the angles.
Exactly, exactly. You investigate all the possible suspects before settling on the most likely one. And that's the approach we need to take with intelligence analysis as well. Treat each hypothesis like a suspect and really rigorously test it against the available evidence.
Okay, so it's not enough to just consider different hypotheses. You need to actively test them.
Yes. And here's a key point. Heuer recommends that you focus on disproving the hypotheses, not confirming them.
Oh, that's interesting. Because our natural tendency is always to look for evidence that supports what we already think. So why is that so important? Why is disproving so important?
Because if you're only seeking confirming evidence, you're going to miss those red flags, those inconsistencies that might actually point you in a totally different direction.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it's like those blinders, right?
Yeah.
We only see what we want to see.
Exactly. Be your own devil's advocate. Actively seek out information that challenges your assumptions. It takes discipline, but it's so crucial for avoiding those big intelligence failures.
Okay, so generate multiple hypotheses and then try to disprove them.
Right.
Got it. Heuer also talks a lot about the importance of being aware of our own biases.
Right.
We talked about some of those already. Vividness bias, confirmation bias, overlooking missing information. Seems like there's a lot to keep track of.
There is. But, awareness is the first step. You can think of Heuer's book as like a field guide to all the different cognitive distortions that can really mess with intelligence analysis. And once you're aware of them, then you can start to actually build in those safeguards into your process.
Okay, so like, if I know that I tend toward, let's say, confirmation bias,
Right.
I can make a point of actively seeking out alternative viewpoints.
Exactly. Or maybe you have a colleague play devil's advocate and really challenge your assumptions.
Yeah.
It's about creating those checks and balances to keep your brain from leading you astray.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all comes together, but how do we stay open to new information, especially when it, contradicts what we already believe? It can be so hard to let go of those deeply held assumptions, even when the evidence is telling us that we should.
Yeah. And that's where the concept of mindset comes in.
Right.
That collection of beliefs, assumptions that shape how you see the world.
But mindsets can be useful though, right? They give us a framework for understanding things.
They can, absolutely. But they can also become rigid, blinding us to new information that doesn't fit with what we already think. We have to challenge our own assumptions.
Yeah.
We have to actively look for information that contradicts our beliefs.
Well, that's tough to do. No one likes to be wrong.
I know, but it's about intellectual humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers, and being open to changing our minds when we're presented with new information. Heuer actually recommends some interesting techniques, things like thinking backward.
Thinking backwards, what's that?
Basically, you start with an outcome that you didn't anticipate, and then you work backwards to figure out how it could have happened. That helps you break out of those linear thinking patterns and explore possibilities that you might not have considered otherwise. He also recommends what are called crystal ball exercises.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah. You imagine that you're in the future, looking back on how things unfolded. It gives you that hindsight perspective.
Right.
Which can be really helpful for identifying the warning signs that you might have missed along the way.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, taking a step back.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this framework now for improving our analytical judgments. Define the problem clearly, generate multiple hypotheses, seek that disconfirming evidence, be aware of our biases, challenge our assumptions, be open to new information. That's a lot.
It is a lot, but Heuer also offers a lot of good advice on the actual analytical process itself, So how to structure your analysis, how to weigh evidence, and how to communicate your conclusions effectively.
Well, let's get into that because I think, taking that theoretical knowledge and turning it into practical skills, I think that's really the key here. So I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty of how this actually works.
Okay. One of the key things that Heuer recommends is decomposing those really complex problems into smaller, more manageable parts.
So it's like taking a giant jigsaw puzzle and just breaking it down into sections, right?
Yeah.
It makes it a lot less daunting.
Exactly. And he also suggests using, visual tools like matrices to help you organize information and to see the relationships between different variables.
Oh, like we were talking about earlier, like a car buying matrix.
Right.
It's like a simple tool that helps you visualize.
Yeah.
Okay, so Heuer actually takes that concept even further with his, what is it, analysis of competing hypotheses technique.
Right.
And this is like one of his most well-known contributions to intelligence analysis, right?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Can you walk me through how that works?
You start by listing out all of the plausible hypotheses that you've generated.
Okay.
And then you create a matrix with the hypotheses across the top, and you put the evidence down the side.
Okay, I can kind of picture it's like a spreadsheet kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And then for each piece of evidence, you ask, how consistent is this with each hypothesis? And you can just use a simple plus, minus, or neutral system to indicate whether the evidence supports, contradicts, or is just irrelevant to each hypothesis.
Okay.
And as you work your way through this matrix, you start to see which hypotheses have the strongest support, and maybe even more importantly, which ones are contradicted by the evidence.
Yeah.
And it forces you to confront those inconvenient facts, the ones that challenge maybe those initial assumptions that you made.
Right, yeah. And when you're evaluating the evidence, you also have to consider the reliability of the source, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Not all evidence is created equal.
No.
Some sources are more credible than others, and some information is more easily verifiable.
Exactly. You don't want to give as much weight to a rumor that you heard from an unreliable source as you would to something that's been corroborated by multiple trusted sources.
Right, yeah. It's all about applying that critical thinking lens to everything you read and hear.
Right. And then, how you communicate your conclusions is really important too.
Right.
What good is a brilliant analysis if you can't explain it to anyone? So Heuer emphasizes transparency, especially when it comes to uncertainty. Don't just present your preferred hypothesis as a done deal.
Right.
You need to acknowledge the other possibilities that you considered and explain why you rejected them.
So it's about showing your work, not just giving the answer.
Exactly.
Okay.
It helps your audience understand how you arrived at your judgment.
And it helps them assess how much uncertainty is involved, right?
Right. And rather than just using vague language like possible or probable, Heuer suggests using more precise language, odds ratios, percentages, confidence levels.
So it's all about giving your audience a really clear picture of how confident you are in your judgment, and also highlighting those potential areas of uncertainty. And it feels like so much of intelligence analysis is really about dealing with that uncertainty, right?
It is. It really is. We've covered a lot of ground with Heuer's insights. How our minds work, the cognitive traps to avoid, and how to structure our analysis for better judgments.
It feels like a mental workout regimen, for intelligence analysts.
Yeah, it is. But the journey doesn't end there. Once you've mastered all these techniques, then you have to put them into practice in the real world of intelligence analysis.
Right.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Because the real world is so messy, right?
It is.
And unpredictable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've been, exploring all these principles in Heuer's psychology of intelligence analysis. But, like we've been saying, the real world of intelligence analysis is, it throws you some curveballs.
Yeah.
It's high stakes. It's fast paced.
Right.
The consequences of getting things wrong can be, huge.
Yeah.
So, what are some of those real-world challenges that make it hard to apply these principles?
Well, one of the biggest ones that Heuer talks about is the pressure that analysts are often under to give those definitive answers.
Right.
Even when the situation is super ambiguous or the evidence is incomplete. Policymakers want those clear-cut answers.
Right.
But intelligence rarely works that way.
Right. I can see how, that kind of pressure would lead to people overstating their confidence or downplaying uncertainty just to, give the people in charge the answers that they want.
Exactly. And that's how you get those high-profile intelligence failures that end up eroding public trust.
Right.
So it's crucial to create an environment where analysts feel comfortable expressing uncertainty.
Yeah.
Presenting a range of possibilities, even if that's not what the decision makers want to hear.
So it sounds like, it's as much about the organizational culture as it is about the individual analyst, right? Like building a culture that values that analytical rigor and objectivity.
Right.
So how do you actually foster that?
Well, it's about creating space for dissent. Encouraging analysts to challenge assumptions.
Right.
To play devil's advocate.
Yep.
It's about valuing those nuanced judgments, even when they don't have those easy answers.
Yeah, and I would think feedback is super important too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like knowing whether their assessments were accurate.
Right.
And why. But I mean, in the world of intelligence, You don't always get that clear feedback loop, right?
You don't. I mean, a lot of intelligence judgments are about long-term issues, so you might not have that evidence for years.
Yeah.
And even then, it can be really hard to separate the impact of the intelligence from all those other things that are happening.
Right.
So it's rarely just the simple case of right or wrong.
That makes it really hard to learn from those experiences then.
It does.
But it sounds like you can still create that culture of continuous improvement, right?
You can. Heuer recommends things like post-mortem analyses
Okay.
of both successes and failures,
Yeah.
and regularly reviewing your analytical tradecraft.
So it's about always trying to refine the process.
Yeah.
Okay. And Heuer also emphasizes that, intelligence analysis, it's a team sport,
Yeah.
right? Like nobody can be expected to have all the answers.
Right. I mean, diverse perspectives, areas of expertise are crucial for challenging assumptions, seeing that bigger picture. And one of the things that Heuer warns against is something called groupthink.
Oh, yeah.
That's where teams become so cohesive that they actually lose the ability to think critically or challenge each other.
Right. It's like everybody's caught up in the same narrative.
Yeah.
And then anybody who has a dissenting view, it's seen as a threat almost.
Yeah, and that can lead to some major misjudgments.
Yeah.
It's so important to create an environment where people feel comfortable speaking up, challenging ideas, offering those different perspectives.
Yeah.
Dissent shouldn't be a negative. It should be a valuable part of the process.
And, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about intellectual humility, right? Acknowledging, that we're all fallible, we all have biases, and that we need to be open to other viewpoints.
Yeah.
So this has been a fascinating deep dive into psychology of intelligence analysis. What are some of the key takeaways you're hoping our listeners walk away with?
The biggest one is, I think, understanding how your mind works.
Yeah.
Empowers you to actually guard against those cognitive biases that can lead you astray.
Right.
We all have them, but recognizing them is the first step to mitigating their impact.
Right. So it's about being aware of those mental shortcuts we take and knowing when those shortcuts might actually be leading us down the wrong path.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even more importantly, it's about embracing uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right? Intelligence analysis isn't about finding that one right answer.
Right.
It's about, evaluating possibilities, weighing evidence, and making the best judgment you can, even when you have incomplete information.
Intelligence analysis is not about finding the one right answer. It's about evaluating the possibilities, weighing the evidence, making the best judgment that you can, even when the information is incomplete or ambiguous.
It's about being okay with that gray area,
Yeah.
and realizing that there aren't always easy answers to complex problems.
Heuer's book gives us the toolkit to actually navigate that complexity.
Yeah.
To make better judgments and to try to avoid those cognitive traps that can lead to those intelligence failures. I mean, it's a must-read for anyone who's involved in intelligence analysis or really anyone who just wants to make better sense of a complex and uncertain world.
This deep dive has given us all a lot to think about. As you go about your day, your week, even your life, think about those cognitive biases that we've been talking about. Think about how they might be shaping your own judgments and your decisions.
Yeah, awareness is that first step towards making better choices.
Well, that's it for our deep dive on psychology of intelligence analysis.
Yeah.
We hope you found it insightful.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to apply these principles to your own work and your own life.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.